Welcome to Environmental Law course, dear viewer and learner. Today we are going to discuss about the noise pollution control in India. We will try to see that how and to what extent the noise pollution control law in India happens to be an important addition to the prevention and control of pollution law in this country. We have seen that Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1974, Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1981 have been very categoric in recognizing the water as well as the air pollution in India. Whereas the Environment Protection Act 1986 is not nomenclatured as prevention and control of environmental pollution because it has the objective of protection and improvement of the environment, and it has a mandate of taking care of the protection and improvement of the quality of environment, and on the other hand it has also the mandate of prevention and control of environmental pollution, including the regulation of hazardous substances. But we see that Environment Protection Act as well as the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act both have clauses in relation to protection of the prevention and control of the noise pollution, and thus we see that Water Act is so specific to the water that it has not made any kind of the incidental references to the prevention and control of noise pollution, but Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1981 as well as the Environment Protection Act 1986 have made detailed arrangement for the prevention and control of noise pollution in India. Nonetheless, what has been discussed and what has been engrafted in the provisions of the Environment Protection Act 1986 and Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1981, we have the Noise Pollution Control Law prior to Air Act and prior to the Environment Protection Act, because the Noise Pollution Law tries to see the law from the lens of the classical environmental law remedy and common law remedy of law of public nuisance, and there are plethora of enactment which have touched upon the issue of the prevention of noise pollution right from the colonial India to independent India and the post-independent India. In the first part of the lecture on prevention of the noise pollution in India, we are going to discuss that how noise pollution law in this country have evolved and developed till today, that we have sufficient judicial doctrination and precedent which have guided along with a delegated legislation on the noise prevention and control of noise pollution rule, which is the law as of now in regard to noise pollution control in India. With this, we try to have an introduction and overview about by discussing that noise pollution has been a late in trend. This is a late inclusion in the statute book because as we have Environment Protection Act 1986, as we have Air Act 1981, as we have Water Act 1974, we do not have a kind of a parallel act which we can say that there has been a parent enactment in relation to the Noise Pollution Control Board, and unless and until that there has been a series of judicial intervention in relation to prevention of the noise pollution in India, and it is because of the judicial intervention that noise pollution control rule have been brought to the fore in 2000, and therefore this law represent a history of almost a quarter of century, and we will see that how after putting into the statute book the noise prevention and control notification or the rule that the noise pollution control in India are being managed as a source of pollution. We see that noise pollution happens to be a kind of a phenomena which is urban, industrial, and as well as non-industrial. It is the noise pollution control is an urban, industrial, and non-industrial phenomena. Nonetheless, the net effect of whatever is the character of the noise pollution, the fact remains that it has a deleterious impact on the health, and therefore we try to see that the noise, be that the man-made noise, be that the natural noise, in the context of the noise pollution, both require the attention of the law and the legislature to see that how noise pollution is going to be controlled. But fact remains to be said that the noise pollution control law has been very effectively dealt under the law of public nuisance under Indian criminal justice system or classical and common law remedy. Most notably, we will be discussing section 268 as we have discussed as in the beginning also, that section 268, 290 and 291 treat noise as a matter of the public nuisance, and all the penalties which are being associated is also to be governed in case of the noise pollution. With this 1860 law of Indian Penal Code having defined section 268 noise pollution and its prescription of the punishment, it finally resulted into the procedural version, what is called as Code of Criminal Procedure of 1973, and 1970 section 133 CRPC lets magistrate, empowers magistrate to remove the public nuisance, that also include the removal of the public nuisance. India's classical and colonial law dealing with Police Act also try to empower the police officer to regulate the music, noise, especially during the public event. So, in any kind of a congregation, public rally, public gathering, which try to create noise, be that noise relating to music or any other kind of a congregational and any kind of the assemblage which tries to create the noise, has been empowered under the Police Act 1861 as a classical law or of the colonial law happens to control the noise pollution in colonial India. So, taking Indian Penal Code 1860 and the Police Act 1861 together have a very detailed discussion on the prevention and control of noise pollution. Then we see the evolution and development of the noise pollution control law has been adequately focused within the precincts and boundaries of the labor statute, because where the factories are established, where the industries are established, then within the premises and the precincts of the factory and where there are manufacturing processes being carried out by 10 or more people or 20 or more people with the aid of power and the machine, it is nothing but natural that the machine try to create some kind of the hammering sound, and all the equipment, electrical fitting and the machine fitting try to generate some sound and some noise. Therefore, Workmen Compensation Act 1923 recognizes occupational hearing loss as one of the ground, and it tries to compensate for noise induced injuries. And the Workmen Compensation Act is a very classical law which have defined which under section 3 and section 4 cast liability on the industries to see that any accident or any kind of a medical injury which arises during the course of employment or arising out of the employment. There are two things which has been mentioned, and during the course of employment and arising out of the employment, these two criteria and these two circumstances are laid down under section 3 and 4, and then the schedule 3rd of the Workmen Compensation Act have a very scientific table of of payment of compensation on the basis of the sum point and coverage, and the computation of the compensation under the Workmen Compensation Act 1923 appears to be very scientific, Thus, what we see that what has been permeated under Section 3 and 4 of the Workmen Compensation Act, uh, and which recognizes explicitly that any kind of the accident or any kind of a mishappening or any kind of the hearing loss injury or any kind of the noise induced injuries which is being inflicted on any employees is to be adequately addressed by way of compensation in the light of Section 3 and 4 of the Workmen Compensation Act, which tries to define that what remains in the during the course of employment and arising the out of the employment. Here what we try to submit that in both the cases, the during the course of employment and arising out of employment are being applicable in case of occupational hearing loss and as well as the noise induced injury, because that these two injuries are going to be inflicted within the four walls of the factory, and therefore both during the course and arising out of the employment are applicable and to be compensated in the Section 3 and 4 vis-a-vis the Schedule 3rd, which gives a very computational chart of the partial loss, the total loss, the permanent loss, uh, and try to see that how this law is the first and the runner enactment to give emphasis on the noise pollution. The other basic law dealing with the labor law or labor statute in this country, which have addressed the question of the noise in industrial setting, is the law relating to the Factories Act 1948. And Factories has three chapters. The first chapter, chapter second, chapter 3rd, and chapter 4 that deals with health, safety, and welfare. And under health, safety, and welfare, it has taken a large number of circumstances which can be addressed through the compensatory mechanism, and that's why the Factories Act is said to be the basic law which tries to adopt the ergonomic principles under any kind of the environmental law. So much prior to the onset of the environmental law, the labor law is the first law which has addressed the issue of the any kind of the prevention and control of pollution. Specifically, the Factories Act list of noise induced hearing loss is very important, and it is supposed to be one of the notifiable disease under the Factories Act, and it requires constant reporting and gradual and continuous reporting of noise induced hearing loss, not only to be notified, but it also deserves to be monitored and to be periodically checked up by the medical officer addressing within the precincts and the premises of the factory in relation to the noise. Thus, we see the basic foundation of the environmental conscience, especially the noise-induced occupational health issues and hearing issues and noise-induced injuries, have been squarely addressed under Chapter 2, 3, and 4 of the Factories Act, dealing with health, safety, and welfare issue. Having said so, that it describes the noise pollution control, prevention of the noise pollution as it has been addressed under the labor law, we will try to see that the transportation law or the motor vehicle law also has a complete evaluation of transport related noise regulation, and in this context we see the Aircraft Act 1934 and the Motor Vehicle Act of 1988. The Aircraft Act 1934, it says that while lacking a specific provision in it empowers the health related rule making in regard to the noise pollution, and therefore the Center Pollution Control Board code have restricted aircraft noise in inhabited areas, and it has fixed certain decibel level in regard to the noise which is being a hovering sound which appears while takeoff and while landing of the aircraft in densely populated area in and around the airport, and the Central Pollution Control Board's code, which try to make certain legal provision in regard to the Aircraft Act 1934, is the another law under the category of the transportation law to address the question of prevention of noise in India. Then we see that the Motor Vehicle Act 1988 enjoins upon the central and state government to set vehicle noise standard, and setting the vehicle noise standard is very important as one of the major tasks of the Motor Vehicle Act enjoined upon the central and state government in relation to number one horn, number one to fitment of the silencer, and it always tries to prescribe a decibel limit for any vehicle to have its sound so that the sanity and the health of the common people or the residential people or the general people along with the passengers who are trying to ply and commute with these vehicles, they are not going to suffer some kind of noise induced nuisance or disturbances and injuries. So having two law from the labor statute, Workmen Compensation Act, Factories Act, and two law from the sector of the transportation industry, be that the Aircraft Act of 1934 and Motor Vehicle Act of 1988, both have addressed the issue of the prevention of the noise pollution. After that, we'll be looking at that prior to no, since there is no specific law directly dealing with the noise pollution, either it is being controlled by the criminal law of the country, either it is being controlled by the police law in this country, either it is being controlled by the labor law of the country, either it is controlled by the transportation law of the country, and we see that what are going to happen in the era when there was no specific legislation concerning the noise. Here, having said to this kind of a background regarding the prevention and control of noise pollution in India, we are looking at the problem on a broader angle, and we try to see that how urbanization and industrialization with the tendency to congregate in a particular area and densely populated area, the growing problem of noise pollution have created some kind of the activities where it has led to disturbance in the sleep, hearing loss, communication issue, and mental and physical problem. So we see that we need a law, and though this law has been due over a long period of time, but how that this law is going to answer and address the question of the man-made noise, meaning thereby it is coming from the industrial sources of machine, it is coming from the vehicle, it is coming from the train, it is coming from the plane, it is coming from the explosion. So all these five sources, and then we have also natural sound like wind and ocean and the hovering sound of the animals. So we require a law to have a better mental and physical health, and also that we should ensure that these level of the noise, because of one hand urbanization, industrialization, and the increasing population and the density of the population in urban areas and metropolitan area, should not affect the cardiovascular system as well as the risk of heart attack and stroke. In this context, it is very appropriate to recall that the World Health Organization recommended only 45 decibel as a benchmark of the tolerance for any kind of a noise level for the cities. But because of a large number of activities, as we are looking at here, as we are looking at here, we are looking at here, these are the sources of the pollution, and sometimes it becomes the general people appears to be in a very inescapable situation of facing more than even the double and the triple level of the decibel which the World Health Organization has prescribed. In that case, the people are bound to have critical health and the physical problems. That's why Major Indian cities like Mumbai and Delhi often record more than 90 decibel of the noise exceeding the safe side, and we require a central legislation which can control not only though the noise has been controlled under the criminal law, labor law, industrial law, and partly the environmental law, but the law to be very specific by the center enactment, as we have noticed in the Noise Pollution Regulation and Control Rule 2000, which have been put to several amendments. One in 2000 has explicitly addressed the issue of the noise pollution. In this context, when we are in a position to frame and reframe and reform the noise pollution control law, a resort can be made to see that how UK Noise Pollution Control Act as far back in 1974, USA Noise Pollution Control Board as far back as 1972, uh, and the Japanese law on the noise regulation in 1978 have resulted some kind of a lawmaking, and in this respect the Indian law on the noise appears to be what has been mentioned in the very definition, that it is a late inclusion of the noise pollution in India. That kind of a feeling we are bound to feel and have in regard to the noise pollution. Now we are going to see that how noise pollution under the Indian Penal Code, especially 268, which says that any a person is guilty of nuisance when he does an act or an illegal omission which causes injury, annoyance, and obstruction and danger to any kind of the people. And then section 268 definition, which regulates that access to the public right, be that the property owner, be that one dwelling into property, one occupy the property, or one has a chance to exercise any kind of a public right, faces some annoyance, some danger, some obstruction, some injury by way of any illegal omission or of any person, then the law of public nuisance is stand up and try to create liability under section 290, and we have discussed that this law have given a fine of rupees 200 in 1860, and we have discussed in detail that the salutary impact which the noise pollution control can be having under the law of public nuisance of 268 and 290 with its procedural version of, of, of section 133 CRPC. Here it is a matter of great satisfaction that India, in its search to demolish the colonial basis of the law and having the indigenous law and the Indianization of the law, have come across a slew of legal reform, most notably the codification of Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita in 2023, which have been enforced from the 1st July 2024, have also an analogous provision of section 268 to 2 like mechanism under 270, and the definition appears to be one and the same. The gist and the essence of the law of public nuisance has been retained and contained under section 270 of Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. There are two things. At one hand, it can be appreciated that it retained and contained the law of public nuisance. On the other hand, this containment and the retention of the noise by controlling all kinds of pollution, including the noise pollution, is the fact that even the new sets and new generations of environmental law, the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita in 2023 was of the firm view of its retention despite overarching power which has been conferred in the Environment Protection Act, in the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, in the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, and especially Noise Pollution Regulation and Control Rule 2000. Despite the existence of such an elaborate and exotic details of the laws to control all kinds of pollution, the relevance of retaining the public nuisance is being reaffirmed under section 270 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita 2023, and thus we see the kind of the deterrent effect which talks about the 200 rupees pecuniary fine. It was very exorbitant in the context of 1860, although it can be said that when the law of public nuisance under section 268 of IPC is being supplanted under section 270 of the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, there was a need to revise this amount in the modern context, because from 1860 to 2023 we find almost 163 years old history, and 163 years old history of this law, and then what amount which was considered 200 in 1860, what this amount is to be computed by taking into recourse to the inflationary trend in 2023. That was an opportunity which has been missed by the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita 2023 in matters of controlling and applying the noise pollution law and the nuisance law in relation to the noise pollution control. Then we have a Police Act of 1861, which under section 30 subclause 3 talks about that the problem of noise from the angle of number one, the music, which is one of the aspects of the noise pollution. It authorizes the superintendent of police is empowered to regulate the extent to which the music can be used in a street on the occasion of festivals and ceremonies and congregation, religious congregation, secular congregation, rallies, dharnas, protests. So all these kinds of law and order problems arising out of the any kind of the assemblage, any kind of congregation, that too from the standpoint of view of generating noise pollution is being controlled, is being contained under section 30 subclause 3 of the Police Act 1861. So, the section 133 is Criminal Procedure Code, where magistrate is empowered to make conditional order for the removal of the nuisance, has given a wide power, and this power is to be exercised by the district magistrate, executive magistrate, sub-divisional magistrate on the police report. The one is the police report, another is by any other information that they are taking cognizance of, or they can have the suo motu cognizance of any kind of the public nuisance which is creating havoc with the people's life. Can magistrate is empowered under section 133 CRPC to order the conditional removal of the public nuisance, including the removal of the noise pollution. We have seen that the noise pollution has been one of the very effective law under the pale and purview of the labor law, wherein the Workmen Compensation Act, which tries to compensate the worker for any kind of the injuries sustained during the employment, be that the partial injury, permanent injury, permanent partial disablement, permanent disablement. It tries to cover the deafness, absolute deafness, hearing impairment caused by the regular and excessive exposure of the noise within the four walls of the factory, and all kinds of noise induced hearing loss which the workers are going to be exposed and to suffer is to be redressed by imposing liability for compensation under section 3, 4 of the Workmen Compensation Act and schedule 3rd of the Workmen Compensation Act. Then we see that the Factories Act addressed the question of industrial noise under the 3rd schedule of entry 22 as a matter of the notifiable diseases, and here the factory inspector and the inspectorate and the commissionerate of the factory is bound to have some notifiable diseases, and that category of the notifiable diseases is always encompass the hearing loss caused by the constant exposure to the noise, and this causing hearing loss or hearing induced kind of the noise or the injury which they are going to succumb and sustain can be declared as an occupational hazard, occupational diseases. And then section 89 and 90 requires the factory manager and the medical practitioner to ensure and to report the cases of deafening by the constant exposure of the noise within the precinct and the premises of the factory. The chapter second, chapter third and fourth is very comprehensive law which starts from a variety of the sections and then try to see that in its provision of the cleanliness mandates the cleanliness means the freedom from the nuisance, and that freedom also include industrial noise. However, besides the entry 22 of the third schedule of the factory having empowerment of the notification of the noise-induced diseases as an occupational diseases and a constant vigilance and monitoring under section 89 and 90, and section 11 which talks about that industrial noise can be included within the canvas of the nuisance and the cleanness, and a perusal of section second, chapter second, third and fourth is also very important to understand the kind of the focus which has been given by the Factories Act 1948 as one of the basic industrial and the factory law applicable in this country, besides the Industrial Dispute Act 1947. But that Industrial Dispute Act is essentially the dispute driven and a kind of a kind of industrial relation law, and try to create a kind of a harmonized industrial relation. Nonetheless, the basic law of the basic labor law dealing with the health, safety, and welfare of the worker is the factories law, have an elaborate provision of containing provisions which try to prevent the noise pollution. With this, we come the Aircraft Act 1934, and it contained explicit provision, and the attention is drawn to section 8A and 8B, which empower the central government to frame rules for protecting public health, which can include the noise control. Under these circumstances, a rule has been framed in, and that rule is known as Indian Aircraft Public Health Rule 1986, where the government has framed a rule to manage the noise and the hovering sound emanating from the aircraft. In this regard, it is also very notable to notice, to underline that the Central Pollution Control Board has prepared a code of practice for controlling noise of the aircraft. The code have tried to prohibit the location, the flying aircraft in a densely populated or inhabited areas by trying to reduce some portable silencer in and around area to reduce the impact of noise. Though the provision ostensibly appears to be very impressive, but it needs to be gauged that to what extent this law is going to be applied with more stringent and very rigorous manner, because the provision requiring to have portable silencer to reduce noise impact is something that has not been mostly visible in most of the areas near the airport, and especially the areas where we have a densely populated people, densely populated area, or the area which are been inhabited the people, and round the clock the takeoff and the landing of the aircraft creates a great havoc with the life and the health of the people. And therefore, what is to be suggested that the study shows that the modern aircraft like Marlin in USA produce only 85 decibel of noise at the height of 50 meters, nearly one-third that of typical airplane. So it needs to be examined that how the Indian aircraft are going to create and what decibel level it is going to create is a subject of inquiry and the research to see the provisions of Aircraft Act engrafted under section 8A and 8B, along with its formulation of the notification in the shape of Indian Aircraft Public Health Rule 1986. With that, the concurrent adjustment which has been done and codification and standards which has been laid down under the Code of Practice for Controlling Noise for the Aircraft are to be rigorously implemented in this country and try to see that what are its administrative aspect, implementing aspect, enforcement aspect in making provision for the portable silencer to reduce the impact of the noise. Thus, we see besides the Aircraft Act, we have Motor Vehicle Act 1988, especially Section 110H and Section 111BC, which allows B and C, which allows the Section 110H says empowers the central government to make rules for reducing vehicular noise emission, and section on the other hand, Section 111B and C allows the state government to regulate audible signals and sound making devices, radio, tapes, recorders, and audio-visual system under the Motor Vehicle Act of 1988. In this regard, we see that the Motor Vehicle Rules of 1989, which have been framed in the light of the BIS approved audible devices for proper warning, and all the electronic gadgets or the horns which are being fitted into the vehicle are now being governed by the BIS approved audible devices, and it has been duly recognized under the Bureau of Standards duly recognized noise limit under the Motor Vehicle Rules of 1989. Thus, we see that how the Central Pollution Control Board's brochure of 1988 is something in line with the Bureau of Indian Standards noise limit. So, at one hand, what has been suggested in Section 110, what has been suggested under Section 111B and C in regard to addressing the question of the noise pollution by the vehicle operation on the road, how this law has been properly been set in place by the detailed guidelines of Bureau of Indian Standards and as well as the Central Control Board, Pollution Control Board's brochure of 1988 in regard to containment of the emission and as well as controlling the noise pollution with that of in line with the Motor Vehicle Rules of 1989. Thus, we see that the classical coverage of this law appears to be very, very impressive, although we have a complaint about that the noise pollution control law happens to be a late entrant into the body of the environmental jurisprudence or the corpus of the environmental law. Nonetheless, the provisions of the classical criminal law, especially the Indian Penal Code, especially the Police Act, especially the Criminal Procedure Code, with that of two laws on the labor laws and as well as the transportation law in this country in regard to the Aircraft and the Motor Vehicle Act gives a clear image and picture that even before enactment of the Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act, Environment Protection Act, and more so the codification in regard to the Noise Pollution Regulation and Control Rule 2000, there seems to be no dearth of law which addresses the question of prevention of noise pollution. With this, dear learner and viewer, we end this lecture to give a background of the noise pollution law, and will be taking the rest of the aspect of the noise pollution control in lectures to become. Thanks and happy learning.